Let's start by talking about why and performance matter.
Right. So what does it matter? Uh, and especially in B2B. I mean, I think there's slightly different case if you're in, say, fast moving consumer goods on the B2C side, but uh, in B2B, it really matters that people know who you are before they come in market. If they don't, if they don't know you exist until they stumble across you after you're in market, you've largely already lost the game. And so, we now have multiple studies just within the last few years from Gartner, from Boston Consulting Group, and then more recently, really good stuff out of Sixth Sense. This shows that somewhere between 80 to 85% of B2B buyers uh, have what's called a day one consideration set, which means they already have a set of typically 2 to 3 brands that they're already fully familiar with before they ever have a need that brings them in market. And that about 90% of the final purchases come from that day one list. And as you move upscale from mom and pops to SMBs to up toward the enterprise, this becomes a stronger and stronger effect. It's very, very hard to sell, especially if you're selling into larger companies or enterprise level companies. It's very hard to sell them something that they were not already familiar with before they had a need. Um, so if a buyer does not already know you and see you as a purchase option before they come in market, you got significantly less chance of being selected. Um, and what this really means is that companies simply buy from other companies that they know and trust, and this is especially true for B2B. Um, but we still need to get in front of buyers when they're ready to buy. So we can't rely just on uh, brand alone, nor can we rely entirely on performance, trying to catch them as they come in market. So if we know that 100% of either is not the right solution, then there's got to be some sort of a correct profit maximizing balance between 100% brand versus 100% performance. And that's a lot of what we're going to talk about here is how do you get some sense of what that correct profit maximizing balance is. So let's start with, what do we mean by the difference between brand versus performance, because I think this is a huge area of confusion, especially in B2B. Because people say, well, we have our logo on the, you know, right next to the call to action, so it must be a brand ad, or it's a brand performance ad all rolled into one. And so there's a lot of confusion. You tend not to see this level of confusion with large B2B, B2C companies. If you're selling consumer packaged goods, there's a really, really well understood distinction between brand and what they call sales activation, or point of sale marketing. Um, so, so what do we mean by brand versus performance? So when is something brand? When is it performance? And can it be both? And if we think of this in terms of jobs to be done, so a brand marketing piece, and again, it probably makes sense to make a distinction between a brand elements, so what I call distinctive um, brand assets, and then brand marketing. So, a brand is a product's unique identity. It's what makes that product look like itself. And part of what makes it look like itself is that there are distinctive brand assets, logos, colors. We'll go into a list of these in a minute. But, in the same way that we are unique individuals, part of how our friends recognize us as, you know, you know, that we're who we are, and not, and don't mistake us for, say, our mother or our father or our cousin, is that, we have very distinctive looks. You know, and humans are really quite tuned in on being able to see very subtle distinctions in sort of visual looks and sounds and smells that help us immediately identify the characteristics that make a unique person unique. And a lot of what we're doing in brand marketing is we're leaning into these sort of evolutionary capabilities that have developed in humans to be able to see subtle differences to identify uniqueness and unique identity. Um, but So if we think about what a brand marketing's job to be done is to implant or refresh durable memory associations between the brand's distinctive brand assets and the product category, along with recall triggers tied to specific buying situations. So if all they do is remember the logo, we haven't really gotten very far. Um, Even if we can get them to make that connection between who we are as a brand and the product category that we're offering a product in, if they don't think about us when they come in market, if there isn't a good recall trigger, we failed. So so in the end, brand is about creating recallable memory structures. So we looked at, what's brand's job to be done. Performance's job to be done is to basically trigger an end market buyer to take an immediate physical action that will advance an active buying process. So performance is about driving some sort of an immediate action. Um, and one of the things that we see right away is that um, these are touching very different parts of the brain. So there are fundamental cognitive differences between the processes involved in durable memory formation and the processes involved in responsive action. And it's really effectively impossible to do both at once. Um, you There are cases where you can do them sequentially, one behind the other, but there's really no mechanism to where you can effectively do both. And which is why we need to really think in terms of separate streams of brand versus performance marketing. Um, and there are actually some very good studies that have been done within the last 10 years showing that even highly performing performance marketing ads tend to leave no durable memory, um, and especially no durable memory in the minds of people who didn't execute the action, the call to action. Um, so uh, and again, there are some very good research out of neuroscience that explains why that is. But if we look at the cognitive difference between brand and performance, is memory formation works best first of all when it's triggering an triggered in association with an emotional response. Um, and the second thing is that future buyers who are not currently in market are simply not willing to invest the attention and focus on complex, sort of logical presentation of product and features and details. So, what that means is brand ads should be brief, focused on a single memory association, and they should trigger some sort of an emotional response to work well. The emotional response has to do with some very uh, kind of ancient pathways in the brain, because one of the problems that all animals have, humans as well, is that there's an enormous amount of stimulus coming into our brains constantly from the outside world. Most of that stimulus is noise. Most of that stimulus has no real meaning. And so in the brainstem, there is a section of the brainstem called the reticular activating system that basically acts as a filter for sensory stimulus coming in, and it's constantly trying to decide, is this something that's important enough to pass up to the conscious brain, or is this simply noise that I can ignore? And one of the mechanisms that the reticular activating system uses to be able to make that decision is, did this stimulus arrive simultaneously with an emotional response? And because again, the emotional responses are happening, at a sort of a subconscious level in the brain, and when it sees that, it says there's probably something important here. I should pass it up for to the smarter parts of the brain to take a deeper look at. And the example on this is, you know, many of us go to the store every week, go to the office every day, and we will go through a stop sign or a red light every single day for thousands and thousands of days in a row, and have no memory of having gone through that stop sign. Because what happens is we pull up, we see the sign, it triggers an immediate response, which is stop and look both ways. If everything's fine, then we move. The only time we remember that stop sign and that intersection, is that day that someone almost T-bones us because they ran the stop sign and scared the crap out of us. And it's that sort of very basic everyday stimulus that occurs simultaneously with eliciting an emotion that then causes that to then go up to the higher levels of the brain and form and trigger the process for memory formation. Um, if we look at the performance side, responsive action requires a separate pathway for immediate action, and you usually need some sort of factual information to drive the decision maker. So future buyers are simply who are not in market are just not willing to invest the sort of attention or focus um, that you're going to see in a good performance ad. So again, performance ads should be information heavy with a clear, immediate call to action because our goal here is to get them to do something right now, if they're ready.